bring home to you what the whole process of aging means in terms of not just that period of time towards the end of your life, but how it plays into your life throughout the decades, really. It's really moving and very stimulating. And I think what impressed me so much about this evening is that this is a multidisciplinary affair. So we've got the academic work that Dr. Dan Davis has been doing. We've got the data that the Centre for Better Ageing brings into it. And then we've got the imagination and the innovation of liminal space. And I think there's not enough in our society, really, of that sort of cross-party. When I say cross-party, I don't mean in the Brexit sense. I mean very cross-parties, actually. But I mean in terms of professions coming together to try and tackle this. And I've written about it quite a bit. It's quite interesting. When I was 40, I thought 55 was very old. Then at 50, I thought 60 was quite old. Now I'm 70, I think maybe 90 will be okay. And when I was a leader writer at The Observer, I wrote one leader about ageing. And I wrote that 1 in 3 babies born now, instead of saying will become centenarians, I said they'll become centurions. So it was very odd. So people were looking backwards. Nobody spotted it on the paper except about 5,000 readers who immediately pointed out that we weren't going back to Rome, we were looking forward. So how this evening is going to pan out is we're going to have a brief bullet points from Catherine Foote, who's going to describe the main points of the very, very good report, which I hope you've all got. Then we've got a panel of experts, but the audience are experts too. And I just wanted to very quickly ask 2 questions, and I'm going to ask the same 2 questions at the end. How many people here actually fear growing old? And how many people look forward to it? So I think we've got quite a big challenge. It's very interesting. There's somebody I was reading the other day. He said the reason for looking to the future is to disrupt the present. And when you actually look back at how we treat ageing, it's very, very antiquated. We haven't modernized it. We haven't got an intergenerational society. So we're still talking about, in the language of the 1940s, we're talking about Meals on Wheels, old people's homes, old age pensioners. And I think in a way we need a kind of new project that there won't be one answer, but we need a whole series of answers, perhaps beginning with vocabulary. But how we make that happen. There's been an awful lot of discussion about ageing, mostly in negative terms, about the demographic time bomb and how much it's going to cost, and not enough about assets and what the pluses are. And one of the pluses might be that this would be a catalyst for actually trying to restore equality to our society, because it seems to be, as I'm sure some of the speakers will discuss, many of the problems that we face in ageing are exacerbated because of inequality. I wanted to just very briefly talk to Sarah Douglas, who's here from the liminal space, and just ask Sarah what struck her most about the research. They talked to hundreds of people about the whole business of ageing. What struck you most about the process?
Yeah, so to create the installation that's downstairs, I hope you'll all explore later on. We worked with lots of groups in London. We worked with Dr. Daniel Davis's linkage cohort across Camden. And one of the really big insights for us was that just how diverse people's experience of ageing is, and how little that is discussed in a kind of public forum. The diversity of people's experience, the diversity of their outlook, the things that they wanted. Another huge insight for us was around ageism, really, and how ageist our society is, how obsessed we are with youth, and how that kind of internal ageism. You said, Yvonne, that ageing is always happening to somebody else, and so how destructive that force is in helping us to really think creatively about our whole life courses and whole lifespans, rather than just lumping all older people together in one giant category. So that's something that we've really tried to bring out in the exhibition, and the real aim of that really was to tackle a big insight for us, which is just how difficult it is to get people to discuss this topic, particularly younger people. It's very hard to get people to relate to it. And so the aim that our company, the Liminal Space, has is to use art and design to make things tangible and relatable for people. And that's what we've done with Unclaimed, and tried to do that by bringing to life personal stories through objects, through interaction. And so what we're hoping is that that creates more of a space to have a more informed and more positive discussion about ageing, which I know we're kicking off in a minute as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One of the labels in the project actually is very funny, because it says, "I'll always take growing old over the alternative being dead." And I think that's sort of a recurring kind of attitude of young people, that maybe ageing is just a bit too close to the end. But if I could ask Catherine to come up and just tell us briefly about some of the contents of the report.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Jolly good. Yes, so here we are, the UK in March 2019. And our politicians and we the people are facing an issue that has profound implications for the future of our country. It's an issue where, let's face it, our preparations are looking pretty patchy. It's an issue that deeply divides people. For some, it's a fiscal cliff edge. For others, it's a land of opportunity and economic potential. And at the highest levels of government, of industry, of civil society, I would argue there is no consensus, no deal as to the best way forward. I'm talking, of course, about our ageing population. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Catherine Foote. I'm Director of Evidence at Ageing Better, and a huge thank you from all of us at Ageing Better for joining us here this evening. We're a charitable foundation working to improve later life for everyone, and this report we published today, The State of Ageing in 2019, presents around 50 or so indicators from publicly available datasets to give a snapshot of ageing now and in the future. And our plan at Ageing Better is to use these and other indicators to track our progress as a nation on ageing and preparing for an ageing population over time. Because this is, Brexit jokes aside, an incredibly important agenda. Our population age structure is undergoing an immense shift that genuinely will change, I think, who we are as a country, and it is happening fast. So, what is the state of ageing? Let's have a look. I'm just going to run through, as I say, some highlights from the report. There's much more in there for you to read at your leisure. So, in terms of how people are faring in later life today, on average, it's true that older people have higher levels of wealth than younger people, but within that older generation, there are stark inequalities. So here we see the 1.9 million of people aged over 65 who are living in poverty. And of course, there are inequalities within that group too. So Asian and black people are twice as likely as white people to be poor in later life. And you'll see here from the second graph a worrying trend. Recent improvements in pensioner poverty look like they are beginning to reverse. Turning to health, that story of inequality, of course, continues. So people who live in disadvantaged areas live shorter, sicker, and more disabled lives as they age. So the bulk of our report moves to look at 4 particular areas of people's lives for that cohort of people who are approaching later life, so people in their roughly 50s and 60s. 4 areas of their lives that have really significant implications for how successfully they will age, how healthy, how wealthy, how happy they will be as they get older. And I wanted to just briefly show you some highlights from each of those 4 areas. So work and finances first. We have more and more older people in our workforce, dramatically more in recent years, and the trend looks set to continue. But despite that, of course, we still have around 1 million people aged 50 to 64 not working who still want to be. Being unemployed in your 50s and 60s gives you pretty much the worst employment outcomes of any demographic you care to look at. And the quality of work matters too. And look here, you'll see the high proportion of people in their later years who are in arguably relatively poor quality work. This statistic here, insecure work. Health is a huge factor here in people's ability to remain in work and remain doing work that's fulfilling and good for them. At all ages, of course, but certainly for people in this age group. And there's a strong, as you can see, socioeconomic gradient here also. So let's talk about health specifically. At Aging Better, we like to think about health not just as the absence of disease, but about what health gives you in terms of your ability to live the life you want day to day. So one of the indicators that we selected for our report was this one here about people who have difficulties in performing activities of daily living is the technical term, but this really is daily living. This is your ability to wash, to dress, to bathe yourself. And again here, look at these stark inequalities for people over 50, comparing the wealthiest with the poorest. And that inequality story again continues when you do look at chronic illness and disease. Really significant differences in the prevalence of those for different people. Now, part of the solution to this is to implement the range of economic and structural and social and spatial policies that would help us all remain more physically active as we get older. So physical activity, along with other health behaviours, is another part of our report. And as you'll see here, however, you can see just how poorly we are all, at all ages in fact, but even more as we get older, at adhering to government guidelines for recommended levels of physical activity. So the next area is housing, where, just before we go on, I cannot stress enough that housing for an ageing population doesn't just mean older people's housing. The vast majority of us live in ordinary houses, and it's where we want to stay. But an extraordinary 93% of our current homes fail accessibility standards, and if disability and mobility difficulties increase as we age, these are homes that will not, already don't, and will not suit us. And more than that, 1 in 5 of our houses is defined as failing the decent homes standard. It's non-decent. That means it's cold, it's damp, it's small, it's dangerous and unsafe. Those non-decent homes are disproportionately in the private rented sector. And why does that matter for an ageing population? Well, it matters because the number of private renters in that age cohort is growing at an extraordinary rate. And of course, within that, as many of you may be aware, private rented accommodation for people in that age group is disproportionately lived in by people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So there are inequalities in many dimensions throughout here. Final section I wanted to cover from our report is how are people in this age group feeling about their communities, about their families, and their social connections. What's going on there? Well, we do generally feel like we belong to our neighbourhood, and this increases as we age. But the shape of our social connections, our relationships, our family structures is changing, which is going to have some interesting and unpredictable, I think, implications for the future. So you see here that over a quarter of women who live alone are in that 45 to 54 age bracket. And divorce rates are growing fastest among people over 50. So clearly, there's not one single story in this report, and there's much for us, I think, to debate and discuss this evening. Some indicators are pretty bad, some less so, some are improving, some are showing a stalling of past improvement, and some reversing trends, which is particularly worrying perhaps. And throughout, though, there are huge inequalities, geographically, socially, economically, in terms of ethnicity. But of course, behind the numbers are real people. So I did want to bring their voices into the room briefly tonight as part of this introduction. So here's a short clip of some people that we interviewed discussing their hopes and fears around ageing, just that question that Yvonne put to you earlier.
What are my hopes? That I go on functioning, that I can go on working, that I can still drink too much and eat too much?
Well, to have financial stability, that's very important.
I hope that I'm still included in society.
I guess I hope to be surrounded in an intergenerational way, so not just with people my own age, but also with young people, with infants.
Well, my fears would be poor health, the loss of my husband losing me.
I already know that my body is going to get tired, but I just wish to not be alone.
I've got a flat, it's a first floor flat with no lift. So as long as I'm able to climb one flight of stairs, I should be all right. But having to face moving when you're old must be really hard.
So finally, I just wanted to say that I've heard some people compare the challenge of responding to an ageing population to the challenge that JFK set the US to put a man on the moon inside a decade. Honestly, for my money, it's an order of magnitude more difficult than that, more complex than that. But I definitely see what they're getting at with that comparison, because I hope we all agree that responding to a social change as big, as profound, as complex as our longer lives is going to require vision, innovation, and a real sense of the tremendous opportunity that longer lives could present us, not just the problems that need solving. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. The baby boomers were this huge group of people, and the people say that it's like a pig going down a python, which isn't a very pleasant idea. But anyway, wherever we go, there's a great big bulge. So you would hope that there'd be some action as a result of all of these people who were change makers in the 60s coming on stream. But I think we're all too busy having experiences and spending our money rather than giving it to our children. But maybe I shouldn't be saying something like that. We've now got a panel who hopefully will contribute their thoughts. Dr. Dan Davis has been running a survey, is it? Would you call it a survey? Project with 2,000 older people in Camden and wider afield about their experiences of coming across the public sector. We have John Pullinger, who's the national statistician, and I'm very glad I could get that last word out, but I've never met the national statistician before, so I feel deeply honoured. We have Lord Best, who will talk about housing, and housing is such a major issue. Over the years, I've done so many stories on prevention and how prevention works in pilots and so on. The pilots work, nothing happens, and people have thousands and thousands of falls a year simply because somebody doesn't go and check that the carpets are fitted properly and so on and so forth. There are so many small ideas that could make a difference in terms of housing. And largely we have Anna Dixon, who is chief exec of the centre and who has brought this centre up from a startup through to the kind of voice it's articulating now on issues like this. So if we could start with you.
Yes, thank you very much. The overview that Catherine gave was really helpful, I think, to frame lots of the issues that we're facing. I mean, I'm a geriatrician, so I'm mainly focused on the health aspects, but those health aspects don't exist in isolation, and I think that's what the report really emphasises. And all throughout Catherine's presentation about inequalities, I can only just reiterate that even more strongly, because ageing, I suppose, only really matters at a personal or societal level, insofar as that comes with dependency or health problems, etc. So no one minds loads and loads and loads of older people, otherwise known as people, otherwise known as everyone here, that we would aspire to be, who enter older life with healthy ageing. Just bearing in mind that all the statistics that you hear, as Catherine said, really actually just are averages. So those averages highlight people for whom ageing is much, much, much healthier, much more productive, and for others for whom it's much more dependent. And the only thing that I would say is that you don't just wake up one day 75 and frail. You you only arrive at that journey starts back from when you were 50, but also as much as from when you were 15, and as much as when you were 5, and maybe even earlier. Who knows? So all of the journey. If aging is an accumulation of your life course, then what can we do individually and as a society to change your life's course?
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Catherine and Anna, and the team for creating this amazing report and everything you're doing. And the thing that really struck me from the way Catherine presented it is that it's starting with people and thinking about people. And those stories at the end, I think, are the thing that certainly I'll take back from this in thinking about how my organisation takes this forward. And those stories were really about connections, people fearing being alone, the people they're with, the communities they're part of, their intergenerational connections with their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and how they live in their houses and communities. And understanding those connections seems to be at the heart of this. And I think you've done a great job in framing a report with that right at the core. I thought I'd give a bit of a global perspective on this, because it's very kind of strongly anchored in the UK, which is fair enough. But I had the privilege 4 years ago now to be the chair of the United Nations Statistical Commission, so the group of my peers that tries to think about how we measure economic and social progress at the global level. And that was the year in which the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed by our political leaders. And I was in New York when they all gathered and made this commitment that at the global scale, by the year 2030, no one should be left behind. And they kind of made this grand commitment. It was a bit of Obama was still president of the US, David Cameron was still the Prime Minister of the UK, and it does seem quite a long time ago, doesn't it? But they made that commitment, and that commitment's still in place, and in fact the UK is doing its own review of how it's getting on at the UN this summer. But when we gathered and we were given this task, so how will we know that no one is left behind? What will we need to measure? And the key to it was disaggregation. It's not in the averages. It's in what are the things we don't see. And there was a big focus there on gender inequality. Big focus there on different outcomes for people of different ethnicities and religions. Big focus on geography, different places, particularly, say, small island states or landlocked countries really struggling to get economic development. But one thing there wasn't a very strong focus on was older people and the issue of ageing. And from a UK point of view, this was one of the things we thought really needed to be remedied, and we raised it in the discussions. And that was generally accepted, with countries from around the world saying, look, this is a problem. Older people are invisible in the statistics, and therefore their voice doesn't get heard when we're thinking who is left behind. So the UK is now kind of the global centre for fixing that, and I acknowledge Rich Pereira in the audience here, who is leading that centre in our office. And we've got a wonderful coalition of counterparts around the world, particularly in countries like Japan and Korea, where ageing is much more closely upon them than it is with us, but also African countries, where just because of improvements in healthcare, there are now lots more older people than there were in the past. And they've got very little understanding because they don't collect statistics on those people. And even here in the UK, most of our statistics are about households. We don't have nearly the level of richness about people living in institutions. So just from a basic numbers point of view, we pledge to do better so that your next report can have even more depth of understanding. Because it's only when you get into the depths of understanding you really get the sense of what's going on. We talked about the baby boomers earlier, and you kind of think about birth rates as being fairly stable. But in this country there were over a third more people born in 1964 than in 1977. So in a 13-year period there is that massive difference. In terms of people flowing through the labour market and then flowing into old age, the challenge that is going to place on institutions is going to be enormous. The report brings out issues of employment, I think, in a very nice way, and also issues of caring. But some of those changes are things that happened long ago we can predict. As Catherine said, this has been a kind of a long time coming, and the kind of parallels with Brexit are a little bit disturbing, but it does really focus our minds on that. So think about some of those long-term trends. We can tell what is going to happen. We can prepare it, only we actually understand it and put our minds to it. Another disturbing trend in our figures over the last 10 years is kind of increases in longevity have been slowing quite markedly just in a 10-year period. So whilst in some areas you'd think it should be getting better, smoking prevalence is declining, health interventions are getting much better, heart disease is much less likely to kill you now, cancer treatment is getting much, much better. What's going on? We know about obesity coming down the track, but even for life expectancy for over 65s, it's slowing really quickly. We need to understand what's happening there. Inequality is clearly part of the answer there. It's slowing much more quickly in places that are, and amongst communities that are much less well off. And finally, just to really give a sense of how we get underneath it, I was once asked on a radio programme, what was the most interesting thing I found when I was responsible for running the national census? And it wasn't a question I was expecting. So I just said off the cuff, I had actually been looking at the numbers that day, and the thing that really struck me, and it still strikes me, is the figure of 1 million people whose primary occupation was looking after a sick or housebound relative. It wasn't that was shocking, it was where those people lived. And they were dramatically located in old coal mining towns. So this legacy of older people being looked after by their wives, their children, their grandchildren. Merthyr Tydfil stood out from one of your slides. And that was one of those towns, Easington in County Durham. Once we have the data, we can see what's happening. We can support people living really good older lives, and many people are. Employment prospects for older people, whilst there are inequalities, have really transformed people's ability to contribute and feel they're doing something worthwhile. But at the same time, the legacy of mining, the legacy of disease, the legacy of poverty is something we need to shine a light on, make a call to action and do something about.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Lord Best, housing.
Housing, yes. Well, congratulations to Anna and Catherine and all the gang. It's a great report. There's lots, it's just full of loads of good things. I am going to talk exclusively about a couple of housing things. We can see what's coming down the track if we look at the numbers, if we analyse the statistics, which gives us a chance to do something about it. But when it comes to housing, I don't think we're doing anything about it. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple of illustrations of what we're not doing. The private rented sector. We've seen some statistics there about how it has the worst record in terms of the quality of the property. An awful lot of the condition of those houses needs upgrading. Yes, that's a big issue, but it's not the biggest issue facing older people in the private rented sector. The biggest issue is this. Generation rent. I expect some of you might be part of generation rent here. People who in my generation would have bought but who are renting today are still renting right the way through into their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And what happens is that the rent, the Resolution Foundation shows us that the rent that you pay is 30 to 35% of your income. And the Resolution Foundation shows you that whether you're 35 or 45, it's still 30 to 35% of your income. It's still 30 to 35% of your income when you finish work, which might be when you're 65, it might be when you're a bit older. But when you finish work, your income, I'm sorry to give you this bad news in advance, it's going to be half. You may think you're going to get 2/3 or finally, none of these things ever happen. You only get half the income that you had before. That's the reality of pension in older age. And when that happens, the 35% becomes 70% of your income. So generation rent, unlike my lot, 75% of whom are my age are homeowners, paid off the mortgage or it's a relatively irrelevant sum now, they're paying 35% of an earnings-related income, 70% of a retirement income. This is hopeless. Everyone's going to have to move. Generation rent hits the buffers. They won't be able to stay where they are. Why didn't we notice this? This is not a small number of people. This is about a third of, or 30%, I think the report says, of older people in the private rented sector. The landlord is not going to halve the rent. You're in trouble. So we need to be preparing. We've got 20 years from the 45-year-olds becoming 65. So what we need is suitable accommodation that is affordable for older people at that stage. Are we getting it? No, we're not. I'm doing an inquiry at the moment about rented housing in older age. The housing associations, they have got to house the older people who are in their general family accommodation at the moment, because they're all getting older. They've got 4.25 million people living in their ordinary housing stock. Those people are all going to need something more suitable, because 3-bedroom housing won't be good for them, and it won't be good for the families who want the 3-bedroom houses with the gardens. So those housing associations need to be building the modern equivalent of sheltered housing for their own tenants, let alone generation rent. Who's going to do it? The housing associations are not at the moment preparing for this great weight of rental that is going to be needed in the future. So that's about number 2 of these unpleasant statistics things that we can see coming. The problem of disrepair, although the private landlords get the worst record in a percentage terms, they are much smaller than the owner-occupied sector for older people. That's where older people are. And there are something over 1 million older people in unfit property that they own themselves. So no point in expecting anybody else to do anything. We can get some disabled facility grants, maybe, to do some adaptations, but basically an awful lot of people on low incomes are in slums that they own. And we can see again, we need a program to do something about this. I was around when we invented the home improvement agencies, the care and repair, staying put schemes that help. They were tiny when they started. They're tiny now. If they had grown in the same way I've watched the housing associations grow, the housing associations were tiny too. They hardly counted for anything. They're now massive. You have 100,000 properties. There are 3 of them with 100,000 properties. So whether that's good or bad is another story. But they are great big beasts, and they are doing an awful lot of important and very useful things. The home improvement agencies are still tiny little minnows doing a little bit here, a handy person scheme, still almost an experiment. We need thousands of people involved, just as they are in the housing associations, in home improvement agencies, and it's not happening. So I've got 2 big housing concerns that are staring us in the face, and we're not doing enough about them.
Thank you very much indeed. I think this is what's emerging here is a manifesto for real change and the resurrection of the welfare state. But Anna.
Yeah, thank you. And it's been great to hear the different perspectives of colleagues focusing on health and housing in particular. I think taking... Is my mic working? Maybe crackling. John's point about the sort of the demographic change, I think the urgency we feel is that we do have an opportunity to really make a change now for the people approaching later life, and that's why as an organisation we have really taken this focus, which is reflected in our focus within the report, not only looking at how older people are faring today, but actually looking at the people in their 50s and 60s and really looking at the risk factors that they face, which I think we can do something about so that they have the opportunity to actually enjoy and have a fulfilling later life. But as we've heard from the stories, one of the things that people say is important to later life is financial security. And as we heard from Catherine around work, one of the things we know is that a lot of people fall out of work before they even get to state pension age. So by state pension age, only about half of people in work. And that is really, really devastating. And so I think in terms of the changes needed there, I think Yvonne's really pushing us to focus on the changes that are needed. And certainly as an organisation, this has been a great opportunity to put up a mirror, to use data, thanks to John and the ONS, for making sure that we do have a really rich source of publicly available data here in the UK to be able to do this sort of report. And I think it makes clear why change is needed and starts to point to the issues that we have to find solutions for. at Aging Better, our work is around trying to use the evidence to find out what's really going to work in terms of the changes. And we've started looking at employers. We've identified 5 things there that we think all employers need to do. And I think they're beginning to recognise the need. And this is where maybe Brexit's going to be quite a wake-up for them. If they're not going to be able to recruit easily from overseas, needing to retain the skills and labour in their workforce. And what we want to now do is to work with employers to really show and test how to implement these changes in practice. And the same is true on other areas that have been touched on around housing. How can we make sure that all new homes are built to accessible standards so we don't end up in this situation where people are looking to move but there's nothing affordable or suitable for them to move into as they age. We need to do a really big push to improve both the condition and adaptability of current homes, as Lord Best has indicated. And we really think a big focus on prevention in terms of health, and are really pleased to put our weight behind the goal that there should be people should have 5 more years free of disability and close that gap that we really starkly saw in the health inequalities. And that's going to really need a serious focus, not only from NHS and public health, but from across the board, and making some of these changes. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anna. The report is really excellent. I read the report, and then also when I went to the liminal space exhibition, there was one statistic that really stuck in my mind, that only 36% of women are entitled to a full state pension because they haven't been able to pay their full national insurance. Now that problem has been there for years and years and years and years, and we're not tackling it. I mean, the panel have come up with some brilliant ideas, as has the report, but what actually makes that change happen? And I just wanted very quickly to read this quote from American writer Marilyn French. She said, "Efforts to solve human problems falter or fail because they are dyed in the same patterns of thinking that created the problem." So I just wondered about, where is the innovation? Where are the new patterns of thinking? How do we mobilise people? People have been mobilised over Brexit. I mean, everybody's going to age if they're lucky enough to live long enough. How do we mobilise that? So we've heard from the panel. It would be great now if we have questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Put your hands up. Speak out. Great. There's one person here. I can take 2 or 3 at a time. So here's a brave man. And there's, oh, good. Excellent. And 2 more at the back. Thanks.
Hello. I'd like to just ask a question about housing. I think it's generally recognised, and has been for a number of years, that we have a problem on housing, that we don't invest enough, that we're not building enough, that we haven't got the right mix of houses given the demographics, but nothing has been happening. And this goes back, well, as far, from my experience at least, 17 years since I've been in government, and it probably goes back further. If you read Nick Timmon's book on the kind of the biography of the welfare state, you read a lot about housing in the first 20 years after 1945, and then it all kind of peters out after the 70s, I suppose, after Margaret Thatcher. There's obviously some big political problem here about doing something about housing. So if we're going to have a change, whatever that political problem is, needs to be addressed. How are we going to get some progress on housing is my question.
Thank you. We just take the other 2 at the top over there. Yeah, thank you. Do you want to identify yourself as well? Sorry, I forgot.
I'm just an older person, born in 1944.
Just an older person sounds like somebody's name. Justin, you speak ahead.
No, but what's clear from the report, very clear, and from the panel's presentation, is how this business of ageing puts a magnifying glass on the problem of inequality and injustice in society. So it appears to be a deeply political problem. And I wondered how you saw the politics of this. Is this something that's really to be addressed by the left and the right will pay no attention to it? Or can you make it somehow a cross-party issue?
Thank you. And there was another gentleman just, yeah.
Thank you. My name's Jonathan Cook. I'm with the Academy of Medical Sciences. I was just sort of curious about sort of at what age do you think we should start tackling these sort of things? Because it seems that a lot of the sort of complaints here about, you know, paying too much for rent or not being able to afford housing is transferable right down to my demographic of, you know, from 18 to 24-year-olds, without putting too much of an indicator of my age. Yeah, like, because renting is not just a factor that affects older people. My age group are already paying a third of our income into renting, and it's very, very unlikely that we'll be able to afford homes until we're into our mid-40s. So surely that one of the solutions is to start, not to obviously write off people above me, but to start at our age group in terms of tackling these renting problems and hoping that that creates the roll-on effect.
Thanks very much. Housing, Lord Best.
Well, I think it might do it the other way around. Start with the older people, and the roll-on would reach you. Because I was talking about 70% of people's income eventually. That's where we're going to get to. How do we get into this? What have we done wrong? How do we get out of it? Well, the social housing, which used to be council housing, as you rightly said, now it's a mix of council housing and housing association properties. This was about a third of all of the nation's housing. It's now about 17%. So we've reduced the amount of social housing. The private rented sector got down to 9%. The statistician on my right will confirm these statistics. And we're now, I think we're just past 20%. So we have seen this major shift from social housing to private renting. And that private renting turns out to be not such a brilliant idea for an awful lot of people. It's going to be a lot more expensive, because the rents are not held down by the non-profit status of the organisation and the rest of it. It's not going to be terribly suitable in terms of the management service that you receive. It may be fine if you're young and fit and not in the place very often, but if you're an elderly person, it's going to be most unlikely that you'll get a lot of help and support as a tenant. It's not a very satisfactory tenure also because it's insecure. If you're over pension age and you're told, well, we'll renew your 1 year assured tenancy, 1 year, you want to know that you can stay in that place the rest of your life. You need security, which you can get in the social sector. That's what we always had for council tenants, and we don't get it in the private. So we made, I think, a pretty serious mistake. Has government noticed that this isn't quite so good? Yes, in a couple of ways, I think government is on the case. Just not doing enough, but we're now going to try and produce 300,000 homes a year instead of about 185,000 homes a year. Government wants to get a much bigger program going, and if you have less shortages, then prices come down and everything gets easier. Government is giving the private landlord an increasingly hard time. The latest English housing survey statistics show that for the first time in ages, in about 20 years, the private rented sector's just tipped a little bit down. Tax regimes being changed, rogue landlords are being chased. Government is getting on the case. I'm on various working groups and things, and we're working on these. And I think we're going to see a requirement for greater security of tenure, which would be a very important change that government's getting behind. So government is beginning to realise we need more homes. The private rented sector ain't going to do it. We were on a hiding to nothing there. Selling off the council housing, which now an awful lot of which, 36% of the sold council housing is now privately rented. It was meant to go into owner occupation, do you remember? Well, no, it didn't work out like that. For nearly getting on for 40% of the stock is now privately rented. It's the properties on the estate that are not well managed. It's the opposite of what was expected under the right to buy in an awful lot of places. So we've got a lot of ground to make up again, but I see a few corners being turned. And it doesn't really matter which political party it is, all as bad as each other. I'm an independent in the House of Lords, so I don't care, as long as they do the right thing.
Dan wants to speak.
Yeah, just something on health inequalities and what their origins are, really. Social inequalities impact experience all throughout the life course. But what's different about aging and health inequalities is that there's absolutely no doubt that the older you are, the more likely you are to get just disease. You know, diabetes, cancer, stroke, heart disease, dementia, all of these things are intimately linked with the age you are. But of course, your route towards that and all of the health behaviours, your education, your physical activity, diet, and all of those things, of course, will change the expression of how likely you are to get those conditions. And so the magnifying glass analogy is really powerful, because actually aging becomes, or looking at health inequalities in aging becomes that common, the final expression of all the things that have come before. And I'll give you a statistic that might surprise some of you, which is that the prevalence, the percentage of people who have dementia is actually going down in this country. And of course, that's in contrast to what may be the potential public perception is, that the number of cases is going up and up and up. Both those things are true. The number of cases is going up. That's the numerator of people with dementia. But the number of cases of people who don't have dementia is also going up, and going up faster. So the percentage is going down because because older people because there are more older people, but the number of people with dementia is going down as a percentage. But what that means is, because dementia is not you don't wake up again with dementia, it's the end of the bell curve. What that really reflects is that the bell curve itself is widening. So the difference between the top and the bottom, and people who do and don't have dementia. Just as an example, you could say the same thing about, so dementia being a cognitive problem, you could say the same thing about mobility and disability. All of those things appear to be widening, and widening very fast.
John, with inequality and injustice, do we have sufficient statistics given to us, the public, often enough to build up a kind of body of feeling about it?
We've got pretty good statistics in the UK on these things, but I took it on myself in my presentation. We need to do much more. It is the granularity that gives you the understanding of it. So looking at some of these things, the granularity around age, single years of age give you much better information, certainly to predict from, than bigger age bands. And when you look at inequality, you really need to look at quite fine grains of sources of income, persistence of income we talked about. I mean, in Catherine's presentation, the kind of sense that older people are often in employment that's much less secure. So it's only by getting really under the bonnet of that we can do that. But that is a kind of core focus of the statisticians working across the public sector at the moment. And the thing I'm most pleased about over the last few years is the government passed something called the Digital Economy Act. And that specifically enables us to bring together data from public and private sector sources to get into these much finer details, to look at information from the tax system, for example, and to do it under kind of ethical, secure conditions so that people can still be confident it's been done properly. But in terms of a national evidence base, that will profoundly change our ability to kind of look at these questions and also assess things like what works. So what is really happening with private rented as opposed to social housing? Because then we can get politicians of whatever persuasion to face up to the consequences of their decisions. And in a sense, take the politics out of it a bit. You can just see straightforwardly this intervention has had this long tail of problems or this long tail of solutions. And I think what Dan's just said now, a lot of these things you could spot them accumulating. And for older people, it's the accumulation of many, many factors over many years. But they're all capable of analysis with the right data.
Anna, Centre for Ageing Better can start at any age. It doesn't presume that it's...
Yeah, so we very much agree that what happens to us in later life is an accumulation over the life course. So, you know, if you are exposed to disadvantage over the life course, that is going to result in you having poorer outcomes in later life. We had to take a decision as an organisation about where we could focus to have impact, and in particular thinking about where we could have most impact over the life of the organisation. And so we have chosen to focus specifically on this life stage approaching later life, but the solutions that we're looking for, we think can help other generations as they also age and enter that life stage. And I think as Lord Best illustrated, some of the solutions are going to benefit everybody. So security of tenure, that will, you know, whilst it is essential to people in later life who, you know, perhaps developing disability and need to be able to have the support of a social network in the place where they live, security of tenure also really important to families with school-age children, wanting to have the security of keeping them in a school. So I think we need to find solutions that are going to work for people of all ages, and that's the same with inclusive and accessible design of homes. Having a wider entrance and level access to your front door makes it a lot easier if you're trying to get a buggy in or your bike. Never mind, you know, whether it provides access should somebody need to visit with needing wheelchair access or with mobility issues. And this is where I suppose I come to the broken housing policy, because I very much agree with what Lord Best has said, and obviously we need to be hopeful that these 300,000 homes will start getting built. But the question is, what are we building? Who are we building for? And there has been a £1 billion, multiple billions of pounds subsidy going to the private developers for first-time homes. And they're getting away with building things that are small and not really going to last, to very poor standards, and certainly not to accessibility standards. And what we found from our analysis with Greater Manchester of housing data is that there are not options for people who are approaching later life, who want to move, who are many of whom are homeowners and with low to middle income. There just are not affordable options in the places that they want to live. So we have to have new approaches to infill developments in places where, in communities where people exist, not these out of town, you know, no services, no public transport, shoeboxes. And, you know, that is a massive shift, and the government can make a choice about how it uses that public subsidy, where it focuses public policy. And we do need to talk about quality housing for people of all ages and all abilities, and make sure that these homes that we are hopefully going to build over the next decade are homes that we all want to live in for the whole of our lifetime.
Thank you. We've got 5 more minutes. Any more questions? A person here and somebody at the back. Can we have another one? Oh, yeah, and there's a couple there. So we'll take those 4 because that will probably... There's somebody down here. Someone down here? Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Congratulations on a very wonderful report. I'm Rekha Elasbrabo. I'm an Associate Fellow with International Longevity Centre, and I'm also a trustee of National Dignity Council. So for me, aging with dignity is very important. We've talked a lot about opportunities and fears for older people and inequalities as well. But one of the biggest challenge and cause of inequality is the attitudes towards aging. Mm-hmm. So we do need to create age-friendly societies, age-friendly workplaces, age-friendly attitudes. How can we do that? And that's not something older people themselves can do. It's a whole much wider issue. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back, and then and 2 more here. Thanks.
Keep you fit.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the report. I'm Patrick Wilson from Help Age International, which is a global network of ageing organisations, and working quite closely with John and his colleagues on the age disaggregated data, the so-called Titchfield Group, which also with the UN High-Level Political Forum in summer. I wanted to ask actually build on what Anna said just now, because I was going to ask it anyway, about the wider environment, not just housing, the sort of the wider infrastructure. And we're doing some work at the moment funded by the World Bank on age-friendly cities, because of course, you know, urbanization is one of the major trends along with global population aging. So looking at what makes an age-friendly city or suburb, and wondered, just for the panel's insight on what they think makes an age-friendly settlement, and partly because it's also, according to our initial findings at least, what's age-friendly is actually sustainable for people of all ages. So there's a sort of a bigger agenda there. And also to say, if as John suggested, you would like to have more of a global perspective, for example, to take through to the next report, then we'd be very happy to work with you on that.
There was a gentleman there. I think age-friendly cities should have lots of loos that stay open so you can actually use them. Somebody at the back, yeah.
I've always been interested in housing as a topic, but I'm a nurse with older people myself. I just wondered if the panel had heard of anything. I've read something about a practice which is apparently quite common in Germany, where people often have their elderly family members or close friends to live in their house. So they go through a process which I think there might be some state benefit in terms of tax relief or something. They sell their house to their younger family members or close friends, and then they live in the house with them in sort of an annex, and then are really involved. It's like an intergenerational situation where they then quite often will look after children, and yeah, it seems like all a perfect little world really, but it's not something that's common over here at the moment.
Thank you. Was there one other question at the back there? No.
I'm Georgie Riley. I'm one of the nurses in geriatrics at the Royal Free. I just wanted to ask really about the fact that building new houses and appropriate flats or whatever it may be for the older generation, you talk about inclusion into a community. Is that something that has been thought about? You know, we're all sat in central London. It's incredibly built up. Where are they going to go? Are they going to be included in that community? You know, if we put them out in the middle of nowhere, are their families still going to be willing to travel there? Has that community inclusion been thought of?
Thank you. I live in Clapham, and they're building what they call well, they don't call it an old people's home, but basically it's you have to have £670,000 for a one-bedroom flat, and it has a coffee shop and a swimming pool, and younger people can come. And if that's the future, I think I'm quite happy to pop my clogs quite soon. Anyway, ageism, it's a human rights issue, isn't it? Ageism, what makes an age-friendly city? Do any of us fancy being sent to the annex? I don't think I particularly fancy that, but who'd like to start? We've got about 3 or 4 minutes.
I can say a little bit about attitudes. Obviously, you saw from the films, we were talking to people of all ages about their hopes and fears. We've done a collaboration recently with Ipsos Mori and a report called The Perennials, if you're really interested in getting a bit more into some of the attitudes that we have globally as well to later life. And it's really held up from the data that it's fairly subjective, so different people think of being older different ages in different countries. And so that suggests that it's culturally specific and therefore something that we can change. And we also know that if we have a pessimistic outlook, so if we fear our later life, that can actually impact ultimately on how long we'll live. So there's one study suggests a gap of about 7 years in life expectancy between optimists and the pessimists. So it's really important that we do change attitudes to later life to help our future selves. And obviously, we do also see examples of more age discrimination, whether that's in the workplace and people not having the same training and progression opportunities, age bias in recruitment that we need to get rid of. So I think it's right that we call out age discrimination and ageism, and we do that, though, alongside a bigger change, a societal change in our attitudes to later life. And part of that is stopping age segregation. This point about the idea that when we get to a certain age, we need to go and live in a special place, in a retirement community that's separate from where everybody else or older people's housing. As Catherine said, you know, the majority of us want to carry on living in the communities that we already live in. We do want to have relationships with people of all ages. And so we need to be much more imaginative about creating inclusive places for people to live. And I think that then leads to the sort of, well, what does an age-friendly community look like? So that's why we've made connected communities one of our priorities. It's why we support the UK network of age-friendly communities, which I think we had our newest member join this week and is now at 31 places, including big city regions like Greater Manchester, age-friendly Ireland over in the Isle of Wight, and some smaller rural places now joining. But it's been a movement predominantly and globally through WHO, originally of cities. That's now changing. I think urban places are going to be places that people want to age. because they want to stay where they are, they want good public transport, they want things to do and to be able to continue to participate. So I think we have to ready our cities, but all of our communities, and think about the built environment as well as the social fabric of those places, that they're really great places that everybody feels that they are part of and included in.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, I'll just say very quickly that we're talking about societal change, but part of the point of this exhibition is that it's about individual change as well, and understanding one's own place in one's life course as people aging, and just stressing that no older person thinks that they're old, everyone else is old. But, so that's all us too, and so one of the things is to invite you to engage with the exhibition and see how that makes you feel.
Very good plug. John?
Well, I was going to just give a quick different perspective. This is the perspective as an employer, and it's an echo of what Anna said about inclusive places. And I think when I look at the data about my workforce, I'm looking at whether older people in the workforce or younger people in the workforce are as engaged in what we're doing. And for me, a successful workplace is a diverse workplace where everybody feels they can contribute and are valued. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the answer to the successful city and the dignity question. Let's look at whether people are being able to play a full and worthwhile part in it. And you mentioned lose, and I can't resist not saying something about lose. Now, I've not been able to check the statistics, so Rich, we really ought to do this. But there is globally a convergence in life expectancy between men and women. Women have always lived longer, and men are catching up, and smoking is quite a significant part of this, and dangerous working environments. But all the places we are building in housing, private and public, have something like a 6-to-1 ratio of women's toilets to men's toilets. So for the ladies, because there are so many more
but
women
we only have two loos in the thing, and men have about 18 urinals.
But the joy for you is, at the moment, you are cursing all the time. When we all get old, it's going to be the other way round. So be happy, ladies.
Lord Best, would you like to say anything?
Well, what should I give my last 2 minutes to?
Ageism. You don't look like you might be the recipient of any ageism, but...
Well, yeah. So I'm 73, and I regard myself as being in extended middle age. It goes on a long time, extended middle age.
I'm 70, so I must be a teenager.
Oh, absolutely. Just a very quick thought, though, for Anna, which is... there are retirement communities and retirement communities, and some retirement communities are integrated very wholeheartedly into the area in which they're based, providing an incredible resource to the area around, a real anchor for what is often a much more fluid surrounding neighbourhood. The Josie Rowntree Foundation created a village to the north of York, which the waiting list is so long that you'd have to be 140 years old to get in. I've just been told. It can be very popular. I used to run the Josie Rowntree Foundation. My deputy has moved in. Him and his wife have moved in. This is a pretty good endorsement if the bosses are in there too, and they absolutely love it. So we want all the different things that we want, and we certainly want all of the new homes to be easy to adapt and accessible from day one. So you don't have to move if you don't want to. We just need a lot more. The wall of problems that's building up is a real crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. The challenges are huge, but I do feel as if awareness is growing and across the generations. This isn't just an older person's problem. It is definitely, if we're all going to age better, we do have to start when we're as young as possible. George Bernard Shaw said, "We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing," which is another way of saying there's wine outside. Thank you very much indeed, and it's an excellent report. Thank you.